On the morning of June 29, 1692, the iron-barred cell in the Salem jail that had held 9 accused women was found empty. The heavy oak door was still bolted from the outside. The single window was too narrow for a grown woman to pass through. And the jailer, a man named Corwin, swore before God and the magistrates that he had not slept for a single moment that night. The 9 women were scheduled to hang at dawn. By the time Reverend Nicholas Noyes arrived to pray over them one last time, there was nothing in the cell but 9 wooden spoons laid in a perfect row on the stone floor. And a small pile of what the constable would later describe in a letter that vanished from the court record within a fortnight as hair, freshly cut, wet, and still warm to the touch of a trembling hand. What happened inside that cell between the hours of midnight and 5 in the morning has never been officially acknowledged by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The names of those 9 women were struck from the execution roster so thoroughly that most historians today believe they were never charged at all. But in the basement of the Essex County Archive, in a sealed box labeled only with a date and the word incident, there are documents that tell a different story. A story of land, of money, of 3 men in a cellar at midnight, and of a bargain made by 9 desperate women that would bind their descendants into silence for more than 300 years. Before we continue with the story of the 9 women of Salem, if you enjoy dark American mysteries told with the detail they deserve, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. And let me know in the comments which state or country you are listening from tonight. Now, to understand what happened in that cell, we have to go back to the spring of that same year and to a village already beginning to consume itself from within. Salem Village in 1692 was not the Salem that modern visitors picture. It was not a town of picturesque wooden houses in cobbled streets. It was a poor, wind-scoured farming parish of perhaps 550 souls, set apart from the wealthier port of Salem town, with which it had been at legal and religious war for nearly 2 decades. The village wanted independence. The town refused to grant it. The village wanted its own meeting house, its own minister, its own tax authority. But the town ruled that Salem Village was a subordinate parish and would remain so. Out of that long, grinding resentment came 2 factions. On one side stood the Putnam family and their allies, farmers of the western uplands whose fortunes had been slowly declining for a generation as the Atlantic trade made the eastern merchants rich. On the other side stood the Porter family and their allies, tied by marriage and business to Salem town, to the shipping trade, to the new economy rising out of Boston and Marblehead. For nearly 20 years, these 2 factions had fought over every pew assignment, every tax levy, every ministerial hire, every foot of disputed boundary. By the winter of 1691, the hatred between them had become the defining fact of village life. Children learned to cross the common ground by a particular path because the other path led past the house of a family whose name their father had told them never to speak. Women learned not to sit beside certain other women at meeting because a generation of grievance sat between them on the bench. Men learned to carry a club when they walked the roads after dark, not from fear of wolves or bears, though those still prowled the edges of the village in those years, but from fear of their neighbors. It was in that winter, in the parsonage of Reverend Samuel Parris, that 2 young girls, Betty Parris and Abigail Williams, began to exhibit what the village physician, William Griggs, could only describe as the hand of the evil one. They convulsed upon the kitchen floor. They spoke in voices not their own, deep voices, scraping voices, voices that seemed to come from behind their teeth rather than from inside their throats. They complained of being pinched, pricked, bitten by unseen hands. Marks appeared on their arms and legs, small red welts that no one had seen administered. And when pressed to name their tormentors, they named 3 women, all of them outsiders, all of them without male protectors in the village. A slave woman from Barbados named Tituba, held as property in the parsonage itself. A beggar woman named Sarah Good, with a reputation for foul speech and for pipe smoking on her neighbors' doorsteps. And a half-recluse named Sarah Osborne, who had married a man much younger than herself after the death of her first husband and who had been the subject of village rumor for a decade. Within weeks, the circle of accusers had grown beyond those 2 girls to a company of 7, then 12, then more. Within months, it had consumed Essex County entire. Respectable farm wives stood in the meeting house and fell to the floor crying that the specter of a neighbor was tormenting them from across the room. Children of 11 and 12 years old testified under oath to things they could not possibly have witnessed. and the magistrates, John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, who had been dispatched from Salem town to investigate, made a fateful decision in the first week of March. They decided that the girls were telling the truth, and that the spectral evidence they offered, visions of the accused tormenting them in forms invisible to anyone else, would be accepted in the preliminary examinations. This was a decision without legal precedent in English common law. It was a decision that would, within 6 months, put 150 people in chains. And it was a decision that, as certain men among the Putnam family quickly realized, could be steered. By the time the Special Court of Oyer and Terminer was convened in June of 1692, under the authority of the new royal governor, Sir William Phipps, more than 150 people had been accused. And the jails of Salem, Ipswich, Boston, and Cambridge were overflowing. The Salem jail itself was not a building designed for the purpose. It was a converted house on Prison Lane, a 2-story structure of rough-cut timber and fieldstone, with a cellar that had been crudely reinforced with iron bars and a single oak door. The air in that cellar was said to be so foul in the summer months that the jailer's wife refused to bring the prisoners their meals and sent instead a serving girl of 14 who covered her face with a vinegar-soaked rag each time she descended the steep wooden steps. The walls of the cellar ran with moisture even in dry weather. The floor was packed earth for the first 3 feet and then stone. And the seam between the two was a breeding ground for rats, which no amount of poison or terrier work could fully control. Prisoners complained of being bitten in their sleep. Several of the older women developed sores that would not heal. The women held there in June of 1692 were chained by the ankle not to each other, but to iron rings driven directly into the stone walls. This was not standard procedure. It was done at the specific written order of Magistrate John Hathorne, who believed, and wrote openly in his letters to Cotton Mather in Boston, that witches could travel in spectral form through solid walls if left unchained, and could afflict the godly even from within their place of confinement. The 9 women in the cell on the night of June 28 were not, for the most part, the women whose names we remember today from the Salem trials. They were not Bridget Bishop, who had already been hanged on the 10th of June, the first of the condemned to die on Gallows Hill. They were not Rebecca Nurse or Sarah Good or Elizabeth Howe or Susanna Martin or Sarah Wilds, who would hang together in a mass execution on the morning of July 19, their bodies left to swing from the oaks on Gallows Hill for most of the day before being cut down and thrown into the shallow crevice in the rock that has ever since been known as the Witch's Hole. The 9 women in that cell on the night of June 28 were, according to the surviving jail ledger, Mary Osgood of Andover, aged 55, the wife of Captain John Osgood, a man of considerable standing in the militia. Hannah Carrier of Andover, aged 38, whose mother, Martha Carrier, would hang on August 19, and whose own name would later be quietly struck from the records. Abigail Faulkner, the daughter of a minister, aged 33, pregnant by several months and visibly so. Martha Emerson of Haverhill, aged 29. Sarah Cloyce of Salem Village, aged 51, sister of Rebecca Nurse, whose composure in court had been remarked upon and feared in equal measure. Mary Toothaker of Billerica, aged 40. Rebecca Eames of Boxford, aged 48. Deliverance Hobbs, whose age is given in the ledger as about 40, but who was in fact closer to 35, a woman who had initially confessed to witchcraft and then recanted, making her the most hated of the accused among those who had not confessed. And a 9th name that has been deliberately scratched from the ledger so thoroughly that the parchment beneath is worn through, as if someone had taken a knife to it in a state of great agitation and worked at it for some length of time, leaving only a pale oval where a name had once been written. What these 9 women had in common was not, as one might at first expect, their poverty or their marginal status. On the contrary, every one of them, with the possible exception of the 9th name, was the wife or daughter of a landholder of significant standing in the northern part of Essex County. And every one of them came from a family that held contested title to property along the disputed boundary between Salem Village and the town of Andover, a boundary which had been the subject of 3 separate surveys since the 1660s, none of them fully agreed to by both parties. And every one of them had, in the weeks immediately before their arrest, either refused to sell their land to a Putnam agent, or had filed a petition of protest with the Essex County Court against the most recent survey, or had both refused and filed. This pattern does not appear to have been noticed at the time. It would not be noticed for another century and a half. And when it was at last noticed, the man who noticed it would not live long enough to see his observation published. The event that would come to be called in those few private letters that survived the incident took place on the night of June 28, 1692. It was a Tuesday. It had rained heavily in the afternoon, a summer storm rolling in off the Atlantic, and the roads leading into Salem village were deep in mud by the time the sun began to set. The sun set that evening at around 8:27, and by 9 o'clock, the last lamps had gone out in the village windows, and the last of the dogs had been called in from the yards. The jailer that summer was George Corwin, a cousin of the magistrate, who had been appointed to the position that spring after the previous jailer, a man named Bridget, had died suddenly of what was officially recorded as a fever, but which had been, according to the gossip of the village, a rather more complicated death. Corwin was 36 years old, a man of modest intelligence and considerable ambition, married without children. On that particular night, he was accompanied by 2 constables, Joseph Herrick, a man of 45 with a wife and 7 children and a reputation for piety, and John Putnam the younger, aged 24, a nephew of Thomas Putnam. The 3 men had been drinking cider from a large stoneware jug which had been delivered to the jail that afternoon by a serving boy from the tavern at the sign of the King's Head in Salem town. The jug was later found on its side in the jailer's room with most of its contents soaked into the floorboards, the wood beneath stained dark in a pattern roughly shaped like a hand. Neither the serving boy nor the tavern keeper could later remember who had ordered the jug of cider, or how it had come to be delivered, or who had paid for it. The records of the King's Head for that month, which ought to have shown the transaction, had been lost in what the tavern keeper described as a small fire in his ledger room, a fire that had destroyed only the month of June and had not spread further, and which the tavern keeper himself had not witnessed, having been, he said, out of town at the time. At approximately 11 o'clock in the evening, according to Joseph Herrick's later deposition, the cider began to have an effect unlike any cider the men had drunk before. It was not the effect of drunkenness. Corwin reported a heaviness in the limbs, a humming in the ears, and a strong desire to lie down upon the earthen floor. His hands, he said, felt as if they were wrapped in wet wool. His tongue felt too large for his mouth. When he tried to speak to Herrick, his words came out slow and thick, as if he were speaking from under deep water. Herrick had to lean close to make sense of them. Putnam the younger became ill and vomited twice into the back garden behind the jail, and then sat down on the doorstep and wept for reasons he was afterwards unable to explain. He would say later that he had been thinking of his mother, who had died when he was 9, and that he had, for the space of perhaps an hour, been unable to remember her face, and that this had filled him with a grief so sharp he could not bear to remain inside the building. Herrick, by his own account, remained conscious longer than the other 2, though he too felt the heaviness and the humming. He sat upright in his wooden chair against the wall of the jailer's room, clutching a Bible that had belonged to his father, and he began to recite under his breath the 23rd Psalm, which he had memorized as a boy of 7. He recited it perhaps 20 times, and it was he who heard, at some point between midnight and 1 in the morning, what he described as a sound of women weeping, a quiet, continuous weeping that did not rise and fall as natural weeping does, but maintained a single low note, like a string being drawn across a viol. The sound came, he said, from directly beneath him, from the cellar. And then, more disturbing than the weeping, a sound of women laughing. Not loud laughter, not hysterical laughter, but a quiet, companionable laughter, as if at a small joke shared among friends who had known each other a long time, the kind of laughter that would follow a remark made in an ordinary kitchen on an ordinary afternoon. And then, no sound at all. The silence, Herrick said, was worse than either the weeping or the laughter had been. When the 3 men came fully to themselves at approximately 4:30 in the morning, with the first grey light beginning to show in the eastern sky over the roofs of the village, Corwin rose stiffly from the floor where he had at some point lain down, took the keys from the peg in the jailer's room, and went down the narrow stairs to the cellar to rouse the prisoners for the walk to Gallows Hill. The walk was perhaps a mile from the jail to the place of execution, up a gentle rise of rocky ground past 2 farms and a small orchard and along a stretch of pasture that had been trampled by the feet of previous condemned and of their spectators. Corwin had made the walk 8 times already that summer. He knew every stone in the road. He expected to make it a 9th time with 9 prisoners within the hour. He unlocked the heavy oak door of the cell. He found the cell as I have described it. The ankle chains were not broken. They were unlocked and laid neatly on the stone floor beside the rings in the wall. The keys to those ankle chains hung, as they always did, on a peg in the jailer's room, 2 floors above, behind a door that had been bolted from the inside. The 9 wooden spoons lay in a perfect row in the center of the floor, evenly spaced, their handles all pointing toward the door. The small pile of hair lay beside them. And there was nothing else. No bodies, no torn clothing, no marks on the walls, no mud on the floor to suggest that the women had been dragged out through any passage. The single high window, too narrow for even a small child to pass through, was still shuttered and barred. Corwin sat down on the stone floor of the cell and did not speak for nearly an hour. When he at last rose, he went upstairs, told Herrick and Putnam what he had found, and then the 3 of them stood in the jailer's room in silence for a long time before any of them dared to speak. It was Herrick who spoke first. And what he said, according to Corwin's later private statement, was this: "We must agree now on what we saw before anyone else is told." In the decades that followed, Salem village tore itself apart over what had happened in 1692. And the 9 women of the incident were absorbed into the larger horror of those months so completely that their names were rarely spoken aloud, except among the families themselves, and then not often even then. The parish records show that by 1697, 5 of the 9 families had relocated, 3 to Connecticut, 1 to the province of New York, and 1 to a settlement in what is now southern Maine. The 6th family, the Osgoods, remained in Andover but ceased attending any organized church until the 1730s. And when they did at last return to church attendance, it was to a church of a different denomination in a different town, under a minister who had no knowledge of the family's history. The 7th family, the Cloyses, continued to petition the General Court for the restoration of their property rights until 1699, at which point Peter Cloyes, the husband of Sarah, died suddenly of what his physician described, in a phrase that would recur several times in this story, as a softening of the brain. After his death, no further petitions were filed by the Cloyes family. The 8th and 9th families cannot be traced at all, which is in itself remarkable, because the Essex County records of that period are otherwise quite thorough, and because the families in question had been in Massachusetts since the 1630s and had left considerable documentary traces before the summer of 1692, and none afterwards. It is as if they had been erased, not forgotten, but actively erased. Their names removed from the tax rolls, from the church rolls, from the militia lists, from the deed records, leaving behind only the negative space of a family that ought to have been where no family now was. What did survive, however, is a series of letters written between the Reverend Increase Mather in Boston and a merchant in Salem town by the name of Philip English. English had himself been accused of witchcraft in April of 1692, had escaped from the Boston jail with his wife Mary by the intervention of friends and the payment of certain sums to certain jailers, and had fled to New York, from which he wrote in October of that year, asking Mather a single, carefully worded question. He asked whether Mather had any knowledge of a transaction of land that had taken place in the final week of June 1692, involving 9 parcels of disputed property along the border of Salem Village and Andover, and whether the signatures on the deeds of sale bore any resemblance to the marks used by the accused in their examinations before the magistrates. Mather's reply to this letter, if he wrote one, has not survived. English's original letter, however, is preserved in the papers of his descendants in New York, and it is specific in a way that Mather would not have missed. English did not ask Mather whether the accused had sold their land. He asked whether their marks on the deeds matched their marks on the accusations. This is a strange question to ask unless one already suspected something about the condition of the women at the moment the deeds were signed. 3 months after English's letter was written, in January of 1693, 9 parcels of land along that exact boundary were indeed transferred to new ownership. The new owners were, in every case, men connected by marriage or business to Thomas Putnam, one of the most active accusers in the Salem proceedings, a man who, in the space of 18 months, had made formal accusations against more than 40 of his neighbors, and whose handwriting appears on more of the complaint documents than any other individual. The original owners on the deeds, the 9 women of the incident, had signed with crosses rather than with their own names. This is notable because several of them, including Mary Osgood and Abigail Faulkner, were demonstrably literate and had signed other documents in their own hand earlier that same year. Mary Osgood, for instance, had signed her name in a clear and careful hand on a parish subscription list for the relief of the poor in March of 1692, 3 months before her arrest. The Mary Osgood of the January 1693 deed signed only with the cross. And the crosses on the deeds, when compared by a suspicious clerk in the Essex Deeds Office some 20 years later, matched in precise detail the crosses the same women had made on the accusation documents that had sent them to the cellar in the first place. Not approximately, precisely. Down to the angle of intersection and the slight hook at the end of the lower stroke. The clerk who made this observation, a man by the name of Ebenezer Bowditch, died of a fall down the stairs of his own home within a week of making the report. His notes on the matter, which had been drafted but not yet submitted, were never officially entered into the record. His widow, questioned afterward by a neighbor who had been a friend of her husband, said only that in the days before his death, he had been unable to sleep and had walked the rooms of the house from midnight until dawn, murmuring about crosses and signatures in a cellar he had never himself seen. The widow did not remarry. She moved some months after the funeral to her sister's home in the town of Newbury, and she took with her, according to neighbors who helped her pack, only the clothes on her back in a small wooden box, which she would not allow anyone else to touch. The investigation into what had truly happened on the night of June 28 began in a quiet and unofficial way in the year 1710, when the General Court of Massachusetts passed an act reversing the attainders of many of those convicted in the Salem proceedings, and granting financial restitution to their families. The families of the 9 women of the incident did not apply. This, too, was remarked upon at the time. And a clerk named Samuel Sewell, who had himself served as one of the magistrates on the original court of Oyer and Terminer, and who had in the year 1700 stood in silence in the Old South Meeting House in Boston while his pastor read aloud his public repentance for his role in the trials, wrote in his personal diary that he had made inquiries and had been unable to locate a single living relative of any of the 9. This was on its face impossible. The Osgood family alone had at least 14 documented descendants living in Essex County in 1710. The Cloyces had direct relations in Salem village itself. The Faulkner line had branched into 3 separate households by the second decade of the new century. But when Sewell, acting on his own conscience and without official authority, traveled to Andover in the autumn of 1711 and presented himself at the Osgood homestead, he was received by a man who claimed the name of Osgood but who refused to discuss the matter of Mary Osgood, his own mother, and who asked Sewell to leave the property before the sun set below the hill west of the house. In his diary, Sewell wrote that the man's eyes had a quality he had seen only once before, in the eyes of a man who had survived the Deerfield massacre of 1704 and who had watched his own 3 children killed before him. It was the look, Sewell wrote, of someone who had made a bargain he could not unmake, and who was forced to live each day under its weight. And who knew that if he ever once broke the terms of that bargain, something he loved would be taken from him. Sewell made further inquiries over the following 2 years. He was a careful man, a man whose public repentance for his role in the trials had been sincere and costly. And he did not rest easily at the thought that there was some further wrong within the Salem matter which he had never been told and which he himself might have unknowingly facilitated in his capacity as a magistrate. He found through a contact in the Connecticut General Assembly at Hartford that the families who had relocated to Connecticut had done so under new surnames, which was not itself uncommon among refugees from the trials, but that they had purchased their new lands in cash in amounts that would have been impossible for them to have saved from the farms they had left behind in Essex County. The Osgoods had held a farm worth perhaps £60 at the time of Mary Osgood's arrest. The family that arrived in East Hartford in the autumn of 1692 claiming a different name paid £215 in silver for a property there. The Faulkners had held even less. The family that arrived in Middletown paid nearly £300. He found through a correspondent in New York that the one family that had gone south had also taken a new name, and that the head of that household, a man who had been a cordwainer in Andover and whose trade could not possibly have supported his family at the level the New York record suggested, had arrived in Manhattan with enough money to open a small import business which by 1715 had become a large import business, and which was by that point entangled through credit and shared ventures with several of the leading merchant houses of the city. And he found at last that an old and frightened woman in Salem village, who had once worked as a serving girl in the Putnam household and who was now in her final illness and had sent for a minister to ease her conscience, that on the morning of June 29, 1692, a covered cart had left the Putnam farm at approximately 5:30, heading west on the post road. The cart had been driven by Thomas Putnam himself. It had been accompanied by 2 riders whom the woman could not see clearly in the dawnlight, and whose faces she had been warned later that same morning not to attempt to remember. And it had been loaded, she said, with 9 bundles of what looked in the grey dawnlight like folded laundry. But the bundles, she said, had breathed. She had watched from the kitchen window as the cart passed by on the far side of the rail fence, and she had seen the canvas rising and falling 9 separate rhythms, not quite in time with one another. And she had turned away and set to kneading bread and had not spoken of it to anyone, not even to her husband, for 39 years. She had held it inside her, she told Sewell, for so long that when at last she spoke the words aloud, she could not be sure whether she was remembering the thing itself or remembering the many times she had remembered it. But the bundles had breathed. Of that she was certain. Sewell never published his findings. He could not, because the implications were too dangerous for the fragile peace that had been restored to Essex County after the trials, and because the men who would have been implicated, though several were by now dead, had powerful descendants who still sat in the general court, in the pulpit, in the magistracy, and in the counting houses of Boston. He confined his investigation to a bound notebook of good calf leather, which he placed at some point in the 1720s inside a locked drawer in his personal library in Boston. He told his son, the second Samuel Sewell, that the contents of the drawer were not to be read by any living person, and that if the house should ever pass out of the family, the drawer was to be emptied and its contents burned unopened. The second Samuel Sewell kept this promise. The third did as well. The notebook would not be opened again until 1843, when a great-great-grandson of the original, a young divinity student at Harvard named Jonathan Sewell Rogers, broke the lock in search of a particular sermon he had been told was kept there, a sermon by the original Samuel Sewell on the text of the 90th Psalm, which the family believed to be preserved among his private papers. What Jonathan Sewell Rogers found instead was the notebook. And inside the notebook, tucked between 2 pages that dealt with the old man's inquiries into the incident, was a single folded sheet of parchment that did not appear to be in Sewell's hand. The parchment was an affidavit signed by the Constable Joseph Herrick in the year 1717, which is to say the year of his death. Herrick had dictated it, the affidavit stated, to a reverend in Wenham named Joseph Garish, because he had been unable to die without confessing what he had seen on the night of June 28, 1692. He had come to the reverend on a Tuesday morning in February of 1717, a man of 70 years by then, his body thin and shaking with what he called a sickness of his bones, and he had asked to dictate a confession on condition that it not be read to anyone until after his death. The Reverend Garish, recognizing that the man was not long for this world, had agreed. Herrick wrote, or rather the Reverend Garish wrote for him, that he had not in fact remained in the jailer's room that night. He had gone down the cellar stairs at some point after midnight, drawn by the sound of the weeping and then by the sound of the laughter. And he had done so against the specific instructions of George Corwin and against what remained of his own judgment. He had moved in his stockinged feet, he said, without his boots, so as to make no sound on the wooden steps. He had carried no light. He had held his father's Bible in his right hand as a talisman and a shield. The oak door of the cell had been unbolted when he reached the bottom of the stairs. It stood slightly ajar, and a faint light, a light the color of a candle, but steadier than any candle he had ever seen, came from inside. The chains on the ankles of the 9 women had been unlocked and neatly coiled on the stone floor. And standing inside the cell had been 3 men he recognized. One was Thomas Putnam. He stood near the door with a small lantern in his hand, the kind used in barns and outbuildings. And he was looking at the 9 women with what Herrick described as the expression of a man counting his sheep before a sale. One was the village constable's superior, a man he declined to name in the affidavit, but described only as a figure of high office in Essex County, a man whose voice Herrick recognized from having heard it pronounce sentence in the courthouse not many days before. The man was standing slightly behind Putnam with his hands clasped in front of him. And he wore, Herrick said, the coat he had worn on the bench. He had not taken the trouble to change his clothing for this particular work. And one was a man Herrick had never seen before in his life, a man in a dark travel cloak, a man whose face Herrick could not now, even on his deathbed, even under the weight of his coming judgment, quite bring himself to describe, except to say that the man was carrying a leather satchel about the size of a small traveling bag, and that the leather satchel was moving. It moved, Herrick said, in a slow and regular rhythm, as if something inside it were breathing. But the rhythm was not quite the rhythm of breath. It had pauses in it where no lung would pause. It had quickenings in it where no lung would quicken. The women in the cell, Herrick wrote, were sitting in a row on the stone floor, not speaking, not weeping, not moving. Their wrists had been bound one to the next with lengths of what looked like ordinary rope, but which, Herrick said, made no sound when the man in the cloak gestured for them to rise. Their feet were bare. Their eyes were open. And each one of them, Herrick wrote, was looking directly at him. Not one. All of them. At the same moment. As if they had all 9 of them known, before he had known it himself, that he was there at the foot of the stairs. He had, he said, fled back up the stairs without a sound, his heart beating so loud in his ears that he was certain it would betray him. He had lain on the floor of the jailer's room beside the snoring Corwin and the weeping Putnam the younger, and had pretended to be asleep. And he had heard, some immeasurable time later, the sound of the oak door of the cell closing, and the sound of the bolt sliding into place from the outside, and the sound of footsteps on the cellar stairs, and the sound of the outside door of the jail opening, and the sound of a cart creaking on the muddy track beyond the building. And then nothing. He had not slept again that night. He had lain on the floor with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling, waiting for dawn. And he had made himself a promise that he would never speak of what he had seen. And he had kept that promise for 25 years. And it had cost him, he said, his health, his peace, and the affection of his wife, who had known from the first week of July 1692 that something had happened in the jail which her husband could not tell her, and who had withdrawn from him by small degrees over 25 years into a silence of her own. The affidavit Rogers found in 1843 did not remain in his possession long. Within 6 months of his discovery, he had written to 3 scholars of New England history, enclosing a careful transcription of Herrick's words. And within a year of sending those letters, all 4 men, Rogers and his 3 correspondents, were dead. Rogers himself drowned in the Charles River on a November evening in 1844 in what was officially ruled a suicide, though there were no witnesses, and the body, when recovered, bore bruises on the wrists and on the back of the neck which the coroner attributed to the current of the river. One of the scholars, George Bancroft, died of a fever he contracted on a voyage to investigate parish records in Andover, a voyage he had undertaken specifically as a result of Rogers' letter. Another, a clergyman named Peter Thatcher, was found at the foot of his own church bell tower in Boston on a Sunday morning, the church having been closed since the previous evening and the door to the bell tower staircase still locked from the inside. The original notebook of Samuel Sewall was returned to the Sewall family papers and was deposited in 1879 with the Massachusetts Historical Society, where it remains today and where any scholar may request to examine it. But the affidavit of Joseph Herrick, which had been the most damning document in the notebook, was not deposited with the notebook. Its current location is unknown. The 2 surviving transcriptions were made by Rogers himself before he sent his letters. They are held now in private collections and have been viewed by a handful of researchers, each of whom has, for reasons that are not always documented, chosen not to publish their findings. In the spring of 2007, a family in East Hartford, Connecticut was clearing out the attic of a house that had been in their family for 9 generations. The house had been purchased, according to the town records of East Hartford, in the autumn of 1693 by a couple who had arrived from Massachusetts with, according to local tradition, no prior history and considerable silver. The couple had given their names as Thomas and Mary Barker, and had told the neighbors when asked that they had been married in Boston and had decided to start fresh in Connecticut after a loss in the family which they preferred not to discuss. They had paid £215 in silver for the house and the 50 acres of land that came with it. They had lived quietly for the rest of their lives. They had had 4 children. They had been known in the community as gentle, reserved, devout in a modest way. Never quite at ease in the meeting house, but never absent from it. Generous to their neighbors in small matters, private in large ones. In the cedar chest passed down through 9 generations was a small bound volume approximately the size of a modern paperback. The cover was made of what appeared to be aged brown leather, but which on closer inspection was determined to be something other than leather. The material was organic in origin, was not the skin of any commonly available animal, and showed structural characteristics consistent with human dermis that had been tanned using methods known to have been in use in New England in the late 17th century. The volume was a diary. It had been kept, according to the opening page, by a woman whose name was written there in full in her own hand. Her name was Mary Osgood. Beginning the diary on the 1st of July, 1692, which is to say 2 days after the night she had disappeared from the Salem jail, and 3 days after the night on which she had been scheduled to hang. The diary described, in careful and sometimes beautiful prose, the life of a woman beginning again in a new place with a new name, and with a husband she had married by arrangement some 6 weeks after her arrival in Connecticut. A widower named Thomas Barker, whose first wife had died in childbed, and who had been told only that his